Good morning. This morning I would like to lift up the topic, do you have what it takes? When we stop at this Sunday morning and we look at the wise men or the Magi and that story that most of us probably know fairly well, the question I'm left asking myself and the question I think we have to stop and ask ourselves is, do we have what it takes? When we look at that video and we take on the meaning of this story in a new way and we understand it in a modern day term, do we have what it takes? And I'll throw this out there. It's going to take work on our part. It's going to take work on our part. Because, we can stop and think about that. Do we have what it takes? And we know that we have what it takes. We know that we have what it takes. If you don't know that, my hope is that by the end of this morning, you will know that you have what it takes. But as we've talked about so many times before, sometimes it takes us to enact something, to do something, to cause that gift, that blessing, that thing that it is sitting there waiting for us to be activated. And as I understand it, I don't play video games. As I understand video games, I think they have little miracles and things that sit there and that you can grab and hold to and activate. But you have to do something. It's going to sit there until you do something about it and activate it. So this morning I would submit for us the question, do you have what it takes? Do you know that you already have what it takes? And are you ready to do what it's going to take to activate that miracle and that blessing in your life? When we stop and we look at this journey that these wise men, this Magi were on, when we look at what all they went through, we can learn a few things. And we still get stuck asking, are we there? Can we do what it takes? Can we activate the blessings in our life? You see, we talk about the Magi and them making it to the birth of Jesus. It happened probably some 2 years after Jesus had been born. And they traveled greater than 1,000 miles to get there. 1,000 miles. That's like us leaving right here this morning and starting a journey and walking to Houston, Texas. How many of you are ready to engage that journey this morning? Ready to engage a journey that's going to take us over 1,000 miles with unknown obstacles, unknown territory, unknown things that may present themselves. Most of us, myself included, complain about driving 3 miles to get here. I could literally walk. Mike Gauss on more than one occasion tried to get me to do that. And I complain about that. But these folks were committed to traveling over 1,000 miles to do what it was they were called to do. So this morning I ask us, do we have what it takes? If we're going to engage this journey, if we're going to engage where we are at in this journey with God and do what it is God is calling us to do we have what it takes to allow us to activate the gifts in our life, to activate the blessings in our life, to go out and do the work that God is calling us and preparing us to do? Are we ready and are we prepared for that? When we look at this story, we can find inspiration in the fact that the Magi were so committed to their journey. They were so committed to their purpose, so committed to the calling that God had placed on their life that they were willing to stop everything they were doing and to travel 1,000 miles into unknown territory, into unknown circumstances to do this work, to complete this mission, to fulfill this prophecy. They were willing to commit themselves wholly and fully. So I ask ourselves this morning, do we have that sort of motivation and that sort of a commitment to allow ourselves to engage on the journey, not knowing what lies ahead, knowing that it's probably not us getting on some camels and riding 1,000 miles to Houston, Texas, but it may be us getting out when it's cold and going down to the Oak City Outreach Center. It may be getting up and calling somebody on the telephone. that hasn't had somebody to call or talk to them. It may be us talking to someone and saying, hey, I know you don't have a ride to church and it's cold out there. Do you want me to come by and pick you up? It might be that we're trying to deal with something in our own personal life that God is trying to work through in us. Us trying to find that healing that we just can't seem to find and can't seem to grasp because we aren't doing what it is God has called us to do. We don't have faith in the journey. We've not fully committed yet. Because we don't realize the grace of God that is on our life. We don't fully understand and accept the grace of God that is on our lives. It's allowing us to get up and go about God's business. We don't understand and fully accept that we really do have what it takes. We already have all that it is going to take for the journey ahead. We just have to do a little bit of something and get up off of our butts and go out and do it. We have to get up off of our blessed assurances. We have to take the time. We have to find the motivation. We have to get up and do. So this morning, do we have what it takes? When we look at this story and we understand the commitment that the Magi had as they took off on this journey, do we have that level of a commitment in our lives? Might I submit that if we do, and if we engage that level of commitment in our life, to look at what transforms, what miracles will take place, what things can be done, what the kingdom of God, what the community of God will look like when we engage this journey, fully committed, ready to go. We have to understand that if we're going to engage that journey and we're going to live into the future that God has for us, if we're going to be wholly ourselves, all of who God called and created us to be, we have to understand that we already have what it takes. And first we have to commit. We have to understand the call and the purpose that God has placed on our life, and we have to fully commit to it. The next thing we have to understand is that we cannot allow distractions to get in our way. We cannot allow distractions to get in our way. Those things that people or the devil or enemy throws out there in our way, those things, those naysayers, they get out there and they start talking and they beat us up and they bash us and we think, oh, well, I've got to go the other way. I can't do this anymore. This isn't and must not be what God called me to do because they done said I couldn't. Because of what somebody else told me I could and could not do. We allow those naysayers to get in there. Magi arrived, and King Herod was there in Jerusalem. All of Jerusalem, it says, was afraid when these guys came around looking for the King of the Jews. Because guess what? Herod thought that was him. So, of course, it made him a little bit afraid. All of Jerusalem got afraid. And like, what's going on? And these wise men, this Magi, show up, and they are here. They had to know what they were doing when they came up asking those questions and the trouble that they were going to stir. But they were faithful to engage. They were faithful to engage and do what it was God had called them to do. They were faithful to ask the tough questions and to do the work that they had set out and had been purposed to do. They engaged that journey, and they did not allow distractions. They could have got there and saw how afraid people were, and could have saw this king probably getting a little bit mad because you're challenging his authority, and say, oh, well, this might be getting ready to turn out bad for us. We might better turn and go the other way. Especially when the king asks for a private meeting with you after you've done been stirring and stepping on his toes. You might need to turn and run the other way. They did not allow those distractions to stop them from being all of who God had called and created them to be. They did not allow those distractions to get in the way of their purpose. They didn't allow those distractions and those naysayers to get in the way of their destiny. They didn't allow that stuff to stop them from doing the work that God had called them to do. We too many times get out there and start the work that God called us to do, and then we get downtrodden. We start doubting ourselves. Jim talks about, and he'll probably tell you about it again when he does the called offering this morning. Vivian went last month and did the lunch boxes of love down at Oak City Outreach Center, and I understand she cooked everything and did everything right by herself. It'd been easy for her to say, you know what, this ain't for me no more. There ain't nobody helping me with this. But she went and did it anyway. She could have looked at that and said, you know what, I can't fix all this food for all these people. She fed 170 people, is that right, Jim? 170 people she cooked and prepared for. That's a lot of cooking. That's a lot of cooking if you don't know how to do that and ain't used to cooking for 160 or 70 people. That takes a lot of work. It would be easy for her to get downtrodden and say, you know what, there ain't nobody trying to help me with this. We get like that sometimes, and we start this journey and start to get timid and say, you know what, we can't go any further. Because it's tough. Because we don't know what's going to be on the other side. We get that way in our life when we start to get right there on the cusp of a breakthrough. We get right there on the cusp of a breakthrough and we stop and like, oh no, that's kind of tough. I don't know if we can do that. I don't know. If we would just allow ourselves to have full faith and forget those distractions and know, my God's got this. God has called me to this, and God will see me through this. No matter what gets thrown in my way, my God will make sure that I see it through to the other side. We have to understand that. We have to claim that this morning. We have to own that this morning. We have to receive that and understand that we already have what it takes. God has already given us everything that it is going to take for the journeys that God has placed us on. You see, the enemy would have us to believe that we don't have everything we need. The enemy would have us to believe that we don't have what it takes to get it through this next miracle, this next thing in our life. The enemy would have us to believe we don't know how we're going to pay that next bill that's coming in, that mortgage that's due or that lease payment that's due. We don't know how we're going to do that. But we have to understand that when we engage God and we allow God to do God's work within us and we engage that in full faith, that God does God's work and God's miracles in and through us, and that nothing is impossible with our God. That nothing is impossible when we allow ourselves to fully engage the Spirit and allow the Spirit to fully engage us. When we allow those naysayers to stop us, those Herods to get in our way and to hold us back. We're doing nothing but hurting ourselves. We need to tear that stuff apart and just march right on through it and claim the victory. The same God that gave us that authority to claim the victory and to claim that we already have what it takes is the same God that was the God of Abraham and Moses. The same God that raised Lazarus from the dead. The same God that healed the woman with the issue of blood. That's the same God that is living in us today and giving us the power to claim authority over our own lives. To claim authority over all those distractions that would get in our way, that would hold us back from being all of who God called and created us to be. That is the same God that's giving us the power to move forward, to live and to love wholly, unapologetically, as who God called and created us to be. If we're going to live into our destiny, if we're going to live into those miracles and into that blessing that God has for us, if we're going to go out and be what we call ourselves a community church, we're going to have to engage all of who God called and created us to be. We're going to have to engage this journey, understanding that we are fully committed, and that no distractions are going to get in our way. We have to understand that. The next thing I think that we have to take away from this in this story is that they did not allow their faith to be questioned, and they did not dare go into this without faith. If we look at this story, they showed up at the place where Jesus was, and they bowed down and they worshiped. They were overcome with joy, the Scripture says. And then what did they do? They opened up their bags and they pulled out gifts and they gave them and presented them. Now we could go into all about what the gifts mean and all that stuff, but the important part of what I want us to understand this morning about that part of the story is that when they showed up fully equipped and fully prepared. They didn't show up to the house where Jesus was and make sure Jesus was really going to be there. They didn't say, well, God, you said this is going to happen, but I'm going to show up and make sure it's all right and it's there, and then I'm going to run back out and grab my gifts and bring them back to you. That ain't how the story went. They showed up fully prepared. They showed up knowing that what God had revealed to them was already going to be there. That what God had revealed to them was already laid in that manger, was already in the mother's arms was already there to give them that joy that they were seeking after, to fulfill the prophecy, to allow God to come and be amongst God's people, to bring about the restoration and the revival that was needed to restart everything that was going on. That was already there. They came in with full faith. Too often we get engaged in a journey and we're timid about it. We want to stick our toe in the water and test it before we jump in. We don't want to go out and do what it is God called us to do until we see some evidence. We got to have evidence. And you see, I can talk to you about that this morning because Madeline and I already had this conversation this morning. I went through my own struggle with that this last, we'll just say, year. We get engaged in this journey and we know what God is calling us to do, but we want evidence. We want to show up and see the baby before we do anything. No matter how many people tell us, no matter how many affirmations you get, no matter how many ways God comes to you and reveals to you what it is that you were supposed to do, we stop ourselves short and we rob ourselves because we want to doubt and we don't want to engage that journey in full faith. We want to get the evidence first. It's almost like me saying I want to win the lottery, but don't never go out and buy a lottery ticket. I sure wish I could win that lottery. But what are you doing to win it? And I ain't suggesting you go out and buy lottery tickets because that's your own journey. But if I want it, I've got to do something about it. I have to engage this journey in full faith. When they showed up with everything they needed, knowing that this is going to happen. I'm bringing all that God has told me to bring. I don't have to question it. I don't have to wonder. I don't have to hope that it's going to be okay and that it's going to be right. I know that it's going to be okay and that it is all right. I know that what God has set into motion is going to work out for the glory of God and God's community. I know that what God has set into motion is going to be what God needed it and wanted it to be for the betterment of all of God's people. I don't have to question it and wonder, should I bring everything with me this go around or should I wait till I get there and see if it's going to come to fruition? I've shared this story with very few people. A few years ago, I went to a doctor and they told me, because I was having pain, and they told me I had hernias on both sides of my groins. That's not, ain't the worst thing in the world, but it ain't something you won't hear either. So they told me I have to go in and have surgery and have those things removed. And I'm like, okay, well, that works. Let's make sure we get all that scheduled. Well, one day I was in prayer and I was kneeled down at what was my makeshift kneeling bench. And I started praying to God for healing. And I felt that healing start. And I don't know how to describe it to you. It's something that I had never felt before, but I could feel myself being healed from the inside. And then in that moment, I started to doubt just a little bit. I'm like, there ain't no way this is getting ready to happen. I ain't no Benny Hinn. I don't know how this is going on. And I felt it going away. And I said, then another moment, I'm like, you ain't getting ready to rob me of my miracle. Not today, Satan. You're not getting ready to rob me of what I know to be true for me and what God has revealed to me. So I continued praying and continued praying on that floor until I felt that healing come over me. And I didn't have any pain anymore. I didn't have any things that bothered me anymore. When I started days after that lifting heavy things, I didn't feel anything hurting me. When I went back to the doctor, they can't find a hernia nowhere. But that's the God we serve. That's the God that we know. I've been in the medical profession the majority of my career. There is nothing scientific that can explain that. There is nothing that can explain that to me from a medical perspective, that they don't just come and go as they please. They certainly can retract and protrude again later, but they don't just go away and disappear altogether. It was nothing but a miracle of God. But in that moment, had I allowed that little distraction and that little bit of seed of doubt to have manifested itself within me, I would have been robbed of the miracle that God had for me had I allowed that little bit of a seed of doubt to have manifested itself and to have nurtured itself. I would have been robbed of that blessing. But greater still, I would have been robbed of the blessings that came after that, because I knew and I was reminded of the God that I serve. I was reminded of the power of the God that I worship, of the power of the God that does all things, and through whom nothing is impossible. If we're going to engage this journey, we have to engage it fully. We have to go on this journey fully, not allowing distractions to come in our way, and to engage it with full faith, all of our faith, allowing us to be all of who God called and created us to be. And lastly, the thing we have to understand about this story is that the wise men were willing to give it all. They were willing to sacrifice it all. I told you at the beginning of this, it's going to take something on our part, and we're going to have to sacrifice a little bit to engage this journey. When they got there, they had a dream, and they returned to their own countries another way. But in doing that, they were defying the orders of a king. They were defying the orders of a king who told them what they were supposed to do. When they left, they were supposed to come back and say, hey, this is where the baby's at. They didn't do that. In doing that, they risked their very lives. They risked their very lives by going a different route. And somewhat, some people might say, all because of a dream. I can think of another person within most of our lifetimes that risked it all because of a dream that he had. Because of a dream in which God revealed God's plan. Are we willing to do what it takes? Are we willing to embrace that and understand that we already have what it takes, that we just now must enact that gift and that blessing and do what it takes? Are we willing to step out on faith and risk it all? For most of us, it's not going to require us to lay down our life. It's not going to require that you pack your bags and walk to Houston. It's not going to require that. But it is going to require that we sacrifice a little bit of our time and go out and be amongst God's people. It's going to require that we take God with us everywhere we go and we share God's love everywhere we go. It's going to require that we stop and speak to somebody on the street or speak to a stranger. It's going to require that we get outside of our comfort zone so that we can do what it is God is calling us to do. It's going to require that we go across the street and meet our new neighbors as they move in and bringing them gifts and welcome baskets and saying, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. We're glad you're here. You don't have to ever set foot in this church, but we're glad you're here, and we want you to know that we welcome you to the neighborhood. What a profound message that can send to someone. To go visit someone in the hospital. Or as I was telling the folks earlier this morning, the nursing homes. People get placed there all the time, don't have family that ever comes back about them. Their family become those caregivers and caretakers that are there employed to be there with them. And in most cases, those folks are called to be there because that is such a special career field. How much would it hurt for us to stop by a nursing home on a Sunday afternoon? How much would it hurt for us to sacrifice one of our Sundays being here in our comfortable space and going out and doing ministry in the nursing home, or better yet, adding on top of what we do on Sundays and leaving here and going somewhere and singing and preaching and fellowshipping in a nursing home? What would that look like? What would it look like if we would take some time and go down to Moore Square when it opens back up, or go over to the Oak City Outreach Center and just fellowship with people, just to be there amongst people? Go down to the LGBT Center on a first Friday night or any other night that they're doing one of the many, many outreach programs that they do, the work that goes on in that place. I've had a chance and opportunity here in the last several weeks to understand and spend more time with them and to see the work that goes into that place. How much would it take of us simply just going down there to be amongst people? They're starting up, and it'll start up, I think, the last Friday in February. They'll start up the Affirming Faith Forum. Again, they're going to change the name of it a bit. But it'll be the last Friday of every month, I think, or the fourth Friday of every month is when that is going to take place. What would it look like if we were just to go there and be supportive? And to say, hey, we're here. We're Christian. We go to church. God loves all of us. The little things are what are the most impactful. I went down in December to the Transgender Day of Remembrance at the Capitol building. And I wore not the high church drag, but I wore my collared shirt. The only person there that was identifying publicly just by wearing something that was clergy. And I can't tell you how many people came up and said, you know what? I want to know more about your church. Simply because I was willing and bold enough to stand beside of everyone else and say, I'm here. I'm willing. I didn't have to say a thing other than just show up. And that made profound impacts in lives. So what will it look like when we engage this journey, when we take on all of what God is giving us, when we enact all of the gifts and the miracles that God is placing in our lives? What will it look like when we fully embrace this idea that I really do have all of what it takes? Now I'm going to go out and do what it takes. What's that going to look like for us? Y'all getting real quiet on me. Y'all must want me to shut up. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to get up and be about God's work? Are we going to get up and be about the business that God has called us to be about? If we're going to do that, we have to understand that we've got to fully commit ourselves. We can't allow all those distractions to get in our way. We have to engage this journey in full faith. And we must do whatever it takes, being prepared to give it all. Being prepared to give all of ourselves. The greatest gift that we could give God this season and in this moment. The greatest sacrifice we could do and that we could ever give right now is to give ourselves and to say, God, use me. I'm a willing vessel. Use me. Mold me and make me to be who and what you called and created me to be. It's our challenge today when we leave this place and for all the weeks to come, that we go out and we fully engage ourselves, waking up every morning saying, God, here I am, a willing vessel. I give myself to you. Use me for your good and for your purposes. Amen.